If you'd like to follow along in your own Bibles, open with me to Genesis 26. Genesis 26 tonight, it's the Isaac chapter. And we get very little Isaac history outside of this chapter. This is pretty much it. This is the long and short of the life of Isaac. So I want to go ahead and get started right into this. It's kind of full, and I want to give us enough time. So let's begin reading, and we'll talk about this as we go through it. Verse 1. There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar or Gerar. So famine in the land. Again, this is the second one. This is the second famine in the land of Canaan in, about 100-year span. And this is the first place that we're going to begin to see the family resemblances. You saw our message title for tonight, Like Father, Like Son. So we start to look at the family resemblances between Abraham and his son Isaac. And the first thing that we come to is the story of a famine that Isaac is going to need to respond to. We're going to take a look at how he responds to that famine. And we're going to compare that to Abraham a little bit as we go through this. And then we're going to see where Isaac ends up, and we find that we're stepping all over the story of Abraham. And if you're not real good with the Bible, you might flip to this passage and think, oh, I remember this story, but I thought it was Abraham. But no, it's Isaac. Well, it was both of them. It's just a very similar story. You remember what Abraham did when the famine struck. Remember, this was shortly after he arrived there in the Promised Land. He pretty much showed up to famine-like conditions there in the Promised Land, and he immediately set his sights for Egypt. Abraham goes to Egypt, and he spends some time there in Egypt, just sort of lasting out that period of drought and famine. And we see Isaac at least take the initial same first approach here, that when this famine hits, he's not content to stay there in the Promised Land, but he's going to move out. That's exactly what he's going to do. Like father, like son, Dad had taught him that, when things get tough and dry there in the Promised Land, well, that's when you just kind of put your faith behind you and you take matters into your own hands and you get out of the city, you get out of the country, and you go somewhere where you have a more likely chance of surviving. Now, that wasn't a good thing. I'll talk about that in just a moment, But let's go back to this name, Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Do you remember this name from the story of Abraham? Now, that story that took place for Abraham, it didn't happen when he left because of the drought. Because remember, first Abraham went to Egypt. But Abraham in Genesis chapter 20 did spend some time in this very same location, Gerar, and had an interaction with this same guy, or the same name, I should say, Abimelech. And so we want to ask the question, is it the same guy? Is he just really old? Did he outlive Abraham, or was he 12 years old when he was ruling there during the life of Abraham? Well, we think it's a different guy. We're pretty sure of that. We look at this word Abimelech, and it's a Hebrew word, of course, that's given to us in the Hebrew Scriptures. And we know what the word Melech means. Melech means king. You remember that from when we were talking about Melchizedek? And that name Melchizedek in the Hebrew is actually Melchizedek. And that word Melech means king. We said that Melchizedek meant king of righteousness. So that word Melech means king. We see that word in this guy's name. So we understand this is not really a person, a singular person. This is like either a dynastic name or title. It's something that was passed down. Let me give you an example of a dynastic title. That would be Pharaoh. Lots of pharaohs, all called Pharaoh. That'd be a dynastic title. Caesar. Lots of Caesars. Different people, same name Caesar, so that again would be a dynastic title. A dynastic name would be something like Herod. Herod was a dynastic name. That name was passed down. Herod the Great. Herod Agrippa, Herod Antipas, all these Herods, right? All called Herod, all different people. That's a dynastic name. So this is one of the two. It's very likely that the son of Abraham, Isaac, is having an interaction with Abimelech Jr., so to speak. And that Abimelech Sr. Would be the guy that Abraham had the interaction with. So different people, but likely a successor. And you remember Abraham's early mess-ups in the land of Canaan, right? He left Canaan when he wasn't supposed to. He lied about his wife being his sister. That caused all sorts of problems in this same region, Gerar, that Isaac has now headed to. And we start the chapter, if we don't know anything about it, and we think, boy, I sure hope that though Isaac is in the same situation as Abraham was, I sure hope he does better than Abraham did, right? Well, don't get your hopes up. Verse 2, then the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. And now he tells him this, verse 3, dwell in this land. Stay in Canaan, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. Then I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So what God's trying to do here is put the brakes on Isaac. Isaac he's had about all he can take of the famine, and he has no faith that if he stays put, the Lord will be able to take care of him. So Isaac begins to move, and the Lord's trying to put the brakes on him. The Lord's trying to say, Isaac, if you got to run, don't run too far. If you've got to go for emergency supplies in a new location, don't leave the land of Canaan. That's what the Lord has told him. Do not cross over into Egypt. Egypt is what in type? As we're studying through this, Egypt is a type of the world. That's what Egypt always symbolizes in the scripture when we take on the spiritual meaning. So the Lord is saying, look, even when times are dry here in the promised land, dry times in the promised land are still better than times of plenty in the world. So don't go back into the world just because you've hit a dry spell. And that certainly is a good lesson for us to take away in the spirit. Because some people actually do this. You know, they get into dry times in their spiritual life, or maybe someone has shared truth with them and truth does not seem to be working out in their life like the preacher said or the teacher taught or whatever. And so they panic and they go back to the world because they think they'll be able to find the fulfillment quicker and easier in the world. And that's a big mistake. That is a big mistake. It is better to be going through dry times with the Lord than to be going through plenty with the world. So stay put, trust the Lord. The Lord has to reiterate these promises to Isaac. He has to say, look, this is the land that I've called you to. I've taken personal responsibility over protecting you and caring for you and providing for you right here in Canaan. You don't have to run at all. All you have to do is trust me. Look, you're not going to get to that last breath and die of starvation. I'm not going to let it happen. I'm going to protect you. Now, this is twice now that we've seen during time of famine that the people head to Egypt. Twice. And we're not done with that. When we get to the story of Joseph, that is exactly what the family of Joseph is going to do. The famine hits the land of Canaan, and where do they head to? To Egypt. Why is that the place that everyone always heads to? Why is that the place? Well, the reason why that's the place is because Israel, Canaan, is laid out very different than Egypt. It's a very different, landscape topographically. And if you take a look at the Nile, you have that Nile River there that goes down through Egypt, and you have that huge delta area. And that entire area there where that Nile delta is just a lush place that absolutely has all the water you could possibly need. But the land of Canaan is completely different. It's not like that. It doesn't have this this huge delta that comes down and waters all the plains and makes everything lush. It just doesn't have that. The land of Israel, the land of Canaan, has always been dependent on annual waterfall, annual precipitation. So if you get a few bad years of no precipitation or low precipitation in that land, in that region, then you got a problem. You start to go into drought there. It's always been the case. And if you want to see that for yourself, you can look at Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verses 10 through 12. Let me just read it to you real quick. It says, "For the land which you go to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you have sowed your seed and watered it by foot as a vegetable garden." In other words, there's water everywhere. You can just squish your foot and push the water where you want it to be. Verse 11, the Lord said, "But the land which you cross over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land for which the Lord your God cares." Listen to this very carefully. "The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning of the year to the very end of the year." Do you hear how the Lord has set this up? I mean, the Lord knew this from the beginning before they crossed over into the promised land. The Lord warned them, hey, the land of Canaan is not like Egypt. You're going to be dependent on me to send the rain in season. And I'm going to be watching over that land from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to make sure there's enough waterfall so that there's no famines in the land. But it's a completely different situation than Egypt. Egypt requires no trust in the Lord for your rainfall, for your crops. But Canaan does. And the Lord knew that. The Lord told them about that, and yet the Lord still chose that land to send them to. And that tells me the Lord was A-OK having the people of the promised land be dependent on Him to be faithful year in and year out to provide the rain that provided the crops that fed the people and took care of them. And the Lord is okay with that too in spiritual life for you and I. I know sometimes it feels like to some that Christianity, that walking with the Lord is more challenging than just going out into the world and getting everything that you need from the world. Sometimes this life of faith can be challenging, but that's exactly the way the Lord wants it. He wanted those people, that nation that went into the land of Canaan, to be dependent on Him so that He could provide for them. That's a state that He's okay with you being in. He likes that. He wants you to be dependent on Him. The more dependent on Him you are, the more you get to see Him do. The more miracles, the more faithfulness you get to see from Him. So it's a good place to be. And that's why everyone just kind of panics in those times of drought and heads to Egypt. Well, there's water there. We don't have to faith it in Egypt. We don't have to trust God. We just go down and there's water. Done. But I would hope that if I were found alive in this time, that I would be the person that would just stay and say, all right, Lord, I'm here to the last breath. If I die of starvation or die of thirst, at least I die here in the promised land, because I know you could have protected me and you could have cared for me and provided for me if you chose. So, to the natural man, Egypt was the obvious solution. No dependence on God needed. Famine was never going to be a problem there, but to live in the promised land was total dependence on God from year to year. And it sounds like my mic just went. We have been having so much technical difficulties, I can't even explain it to you. I'm just going to go on. I guess that thing died. All right, so in dry times, don't leave the promised land. Don't leave that walk that you have with the Lord. Don't leave that life of faith. If anything, amp up your prayer life. Increase your devotion to the Lord. Really test and try your trust in Him and let it grow in those times. All right, verse 6. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar. And now Gerar is on the outskirts of Canaan. And it is about as close to Egypt as a town could be. You know, we've been seeing this a lot in the life of Abraham, this coming up to the border and stopping right at the border. Well, that's exactly what Isaac has done. He starts to move. The Lord tries to stop him. The Lord says, don't go out of Canaan. Stay here in this land. And what does Isaac do? He goes to Gerar, which is about as far as you could go without crossing over into Egypt. Now, if you look at this on the map, Hebron and Beersheba, which is going to be the landing spot of Isaac, those are all right in the center of the map, right in the center of Canaan. And I kind of see that as God's description of that's what it looks like to be in the center of God's will. You are equally as distant from any part of the unbelieving world as you could be there in the center in Hebron. And that's where the Lord wanted Abraham. And that's where the Lord wants Isaac to be. He wants him to be right there in the center, as far away from the world on every side as he could possibly be. But Isaac heads for the border. He gets to Gerar. He, in my opinion, comes to the outskirts of the will of God, and that is a dangerous place to be. Why do people do that? Why do Christians do that? Why do Christians, when they know the center of God's will, where that is and what that looks like, why do they want to get to the outskirts of God's will and say, now tell me, Arlyn, how close to the world can I get without crossing over? How close to sin can I come without committing it? How close to hell can I get without actually being thrown into it? And we have those people that in their walk that kind of explains it. They just want to get so close to the world, but they want to technically still be in God's will, because that's kind of where Isaac is. Technically, he's still in God's will. Technically, he's still in the land, but is he really in God's will? As we look at this story unfold, it's tough to say that he is. Verse 7, and the men of the place ask about his wife. Oh boy. And he said, she is my... Does this story sound awfully familiar? This is take 3 now. He said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, she is my wife, because he thought... Now, do you remember why Abraham did this? Abraham did this for the same reason, because he thought... And Isaac is in the exact same spot. He's lying about his wife. He says, she's my sister, because he thought, lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now it came to pass when he had been there a long time, and hold it right there. Let me just say, men, if you're single, maybe it's not the best idea to look for the best looking woman out there. This seems to be getting these Bible characters in a whole lot of trouble. But here he is making the same mistakes as his dad. It's unbelievable. His dad did this twice, at least, that we know of. And here's Isaac repeating the same behavior, like father, like son. We're seeing Isaac effortlessly adopting the weaknesses of his father Abraham, and yet we're going to see that the strengths of Abraham aren't so effortlessly adopted by Isaac. You see the weaknesses of Abraham in the son, it's like night and day, but it's tough to see those strengths of Abraham in his son Isaac. And it's a good reminder to parents that we have to be so careful with our failures. We have to be so careful with our mistakes, because if we're making a lot of them, I'm just here to tell you, your kids are going to pick up on those a whole lot quicker than they do your strengths. They're going to pick up on the bad, and that's going to be incorporated into their life and into their thought process through life. That's a lot more effortless than it is for them to see your strengths and see the good that you do and the accomplishments that are positive and incorporate those into your life. So let's just be careful and try to make those weaknesses and failures and sins as far and few in between as absolutely possible. So Isaac, we saw here in verse 8, was there for a long time. So this lie, it was perpetuated for quite a while. He was getting away with this successfully. No one suspected the lie. And he would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that meddling Abimelech. But look what happens. In verse 8, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window. He was peeping Tom. And he saw there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife. I love how the New King James Version tries to cushion this. Now, the King James Version says that Abimelech saw Isaac sporting with his wife, but that does not mean that they were playing a game of one-on-one pickup basketball. That is not what that means. If you look at this word sporting or showing endearment in the Hebrew, what it actually means is that they were being playfully affectionate. They were being playfully intimate. You know, when you see two people giggling and touching one another and just romantically playing, you go, well, those two are not brother and sister. And that's what Abimelech does. He sees their behavior. Why he was looking through the window in the first place, I don't know. But he sees their behavior, and he says this in verse 9. Abimelech called Isaac and said, quite obviously, she is your wife. Quite obviously, she is your wife. So how could you say she's my sister? Isaac said to him, because I said, lest I die on account of her. Now, husbands, I tell you, I'm beating you over the head with this Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 verse. But I got to do it again because here we are in the scriptures. What was Isaac's problem? What was the fear he had? The fear was that he would have to lay down his life for his wife, and he didn't want that to happen. And he says, well, you know, Dad taught me. Doesn't so much matter what happened to the women folk as long as I keep myself alive. That's what my dad taught me. And that's what I'm going to do. But when we look at Ephesians 5:25 and what the scriptures tells husbands to do, let's just read it again. If you're getting sick of it, good. Then maybe you'll start putting it into practice for once, right? All right, here it is. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. Isaac, what a beautiful story it would have been if he was willing to give his life for his wife. But he says, I didn't want to die on account of her. I wanted my life to go well. I wasn't so much concerned about her inconvenience or the sin that she fell into as long as I wasn't affected. Same thing as Abraham. Man, Abraham must have taught him this in their family devotions or something. I don't know. But he had the wrong concept, and this just spread down through the family like a plague. But at least here he's honest. At least he doesn't try to defend himself or skirt around the issue. He's caught, and he admits it. He confesses, and he continues. And that's all you can really do when you find yourself hung up in sin like this. Because that's what this is. This is sin. This is a lie. This is deception. This is something that should come from the world and the enemy, but not the church and not God's people. And sometimes all you can do is just face the facts of what you've done wrong. You know that you can't fix your sin. You know, when you sin and when you hurt people, you can't fix it. Sometimes the only thing that you can do is confess and continue. And watch what happens when Isaac comes into this state of just confessing and continuing. Verse 10. Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, he who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. It sounds to me like Abimelech Sr. had talked with his son Abimelech Jr. and said, look, if anyone ever shows up around here from Canaan and lies to you about his sister being his wife, you stay away from that couple. You get away from them as far as you can because they're nothing but trouble. If you only heard the story of what happened to us because of that couple from Canaan, you'd learn the lesson and you'd stay away from them. And that's exactly what Abimelech Sr. here does. No one go near that couple. This is a troublesome situation. Do you remember what happened to the other nation that didn't know about the lie of Abraham and how the entire nation had been made impotent by the Lord and wombs were barren? The Lord did all that, and boy, they're just barely getting past that without issues. But verse 12. Then Isaac sowed in that land. So this wasn't enough to cause Isaac to say, well, I've really troubled these waters enough. I think it's time for me to move on to greener plains here. But no, he's going to stay put. Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. That's weird after what just happened. The Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him. So if you're like me, an honest reader, you're reading this story, you just get out of the lie. He confesses. Nothing really seems to be resolved. The Philistines are upset. And all of a sudden, we begin to read here about Isaac sowing in the land, and the blessings begin to pour in. Look how many times that is stressed in verses 12 through 14. It says, let's see here, 100-fold, blessed, prosper, prospering, prosperous, possessions, flocks, possessions, servants. I mean, my goodness, life was good for Isaac, and we ask the question, did he really deserve this? Should this really have happened, considering the situation? Well, you know what? This all just comes back to God. Number one, when there's sin in our lives, that creates an obstacle between us and the Lord. And you'll notice, just like with the story of Isaac, the story of Abraham, you'll notice the Lord stops talking. The Lord stops directing. The Lord stops paying attention to prayer. David said, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear my prayers. I've put that there. That's not God's problem. That's not God being angry at me. That's me. I put sin in between me and the Lord, and that's going to affect me in the Lord. But here's all the Lord needs when we have that sin in our life, is that confession and continuation that Isaac found in the previous verses. That's what he wants from us. And when we do that, we remove that obstacle. And it has to be true confession. You know, we can't play the game. Well, I'll just go have that affair. And then I'll 1 John 1, 8, and 9 it and just confess it and I'll be good. No, you don't premeditate your sin and then your confession. But if you fall to sin, if you get yourself caught up in sin, and then you confess it, that's clearing the air between you and the Lord. And that frees him up to begin to speak to you again and to begin to move in your life again and to begin to bless you again. So that obstacle is gone with Isaac. We would never say he merited these blessings, that he deserved these blessings. But the obstacles between him and God are gone. And so what can God do? Everything he's been telling this family line, this family tree that he would do. He's being faithful to the promises that he gave to this family tree. And I'm going to take it a step further than that. I think this is also strategic. As we're studying through this, we understand that Isaac is in a place that the Lord doesn't want him to be. And you're going to see what happens in this chapter. The Lord is going to get him moved back to the center of Canaan. He's going to get Isaac moved back to the center of his will. So the Lord has to come up with a plan to do that. Because as you can see, Isaac is digging in the cleats. He's not moving. I mean, he didn't embarrass himself enough in front of the Philistines with that whole mess. By the way, his lie was even worse than Abraham if we're going to put him in degrees. Because when Abraham said, she's my sister, speaking about Sarah, at least that was kind of true. It was his half-sister. It was also his wife, so he was deceiving and therefore it was a lie. But this is not Isaac's sister that he's married to. She's a relative, yes, but this is not his sister. This is just a flat-out lie. So it's much worse. But here's what the Lord has to do. Since nothing is moving Isaac away from the outskirts of the will of God, the outskirts of the promised land, the Lord has to get strategic here, and I think that's exactly what this is. I think this is strategic on the Lord's part. Now, if you're the Lord and you're thinking like him, you'd begin to question, how can I get Isaac out of there? You know, the confrontations with the Philistines, that's not working. Embarrassing himself and humiliating my name in front of the Philistines, that's not working. He's planting, he's sowing, he's putting the garden in and getting the farm running, and he's not going anytime soon. So what can I do to get him out of there? And I think that the Lord chose not to starve him out of there, not to bring another famine to the land of Gerar, not to starve him out of there, but to bless him out of there. Because what begins to happen as the Lord blesses Isaac here is that the Philistines, as we just read there in verse 14, they become jealous of the blessing and the prosperity of Isaac. And that jealousy on behalf of the Philistines is going to cause the strain and the contention that we're going to follow in the rest of this story. And it's all of that contention and that strain from the prosperity of Isaac that finally gets him moving and searching and working his way back to the center of the land. And that's exactly how it's going to play out. Now, maybe you're wondering, well, is that really something the Lord would do? Would the Lord intentionally provoke the Philistines to jealousy just so that he can have his will accomplished in the life of Isaac? Well, if you know your New Testament scriptures, 3 times in the book of Romans, Paul says concerning the Jews, the unbelieving Jews, that God's plan is to use the Gentiles to provoke the unbelieving Jews to what? Jealousy. Now, if the Lord would provoke the believers, the future believers, to jealousy, then don't you think he would provoke unbelievers to begin to move and act and help God to push his will along in the life of a believer? I think he would. And I think that's exactly what he did. So, let's watch this happen. Verse 15. Now my eyesight's getting bad. Now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they had filled them with earth. So what do you do when you get jealous? You start throwing dirt. And that's what they're doing. They're throwing dirt. They're throwing dirt in the wells. They're filling the wells up with dirt. But as someone once said, when you're throwing dirt at others, all you're really doing is losing ground. It's true in every sense. They're throwing dirt. By the way, they had an agreement with Abraham to respect the possessions and the landmarkers of Abraham, and they're breaking that right here. The Philistines aren't good for their word. Those wells that Abraham dug, those wells that belong to Abraham, they're filling them up, they're clogging them up with debris. And that's not the worst of the character that you'll see out of the Philistines. It's only going to get increasingly worse as time goes along. Verse 16, and Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." Then Isaac departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. Now he didn't go far. He was in Gerar, and now he goes to the valley of Gerar. He didn't go far. He's tough to unplant, to pluck up from his spot, but he does make his way down into the valley of Gerar. He's moving a little bit now, and he dwelt there, the scripture says, verse 18. And Isaac dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called them by the names which his father had called them. This is such a rich topic. I wish I could spend a lot of time on this, but let me just make it short and sweet, and you'll have to think through the rest of this and let this soak into your spirit later. But parents, be digging those wells for your family. What are we talking about when we say dig wells for your family? Well, what does a well produce? A well produces flowing, life-giving source, that water. When we look to the New Testament, John chapter 7, Jesus said, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scriptures has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." So we know the New Testament comparison there is that Christ is the living water. The Holy Spirit is the living water. The scripture says, this he spoke concerning the Holy Spirit. And when we say parents, be digging those wells for your families, for your children, what we're saying is provide those avenues to good, healthy spiritual life for them. How do you dig wells in spiritual life? You go to church. You study the Word with your kids. You teach them about Christ. You model Christian conduct. You teach them to pray through their problems. You teach them to trust the Lord. You worship with them. All of those things are digging wells. And kids, the reverse side of this, when you get older and you get moved out away from home and life begins to clog up those wells that your parents have dug for you, that source, that flow of the Spirit into your life, that teaching, that training, that discipline, get your shovels out and start unclogging those wells that your parents labored to dig for you and provide for you. Unclog those things. Call them the same things your parents called them. I love the symbolism here, and I wish I could speak more about that. But verse 19, also Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found a well of running water there. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdmen, saying, the water is ours. So he called the name of the well Esek, because they quarreled with him. And Esek means contention. Verse 21, then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So he called its name Sitnah. And Sitnah means opposition or enemy or hatred. Verse 22, and he moved from there and dug another well. You see what's happening here? And they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, because he said, for now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. Rehoboth means roominess. And I found a spot where I got some elbow room. I found a spot where no one's contending with me. No one's pushing up against me. I've got space to just live. So these Philistines had a good thing going for a while. They would, sit back and hide behind the bushes or run along with the tumbleweed as it's rolling through the desert, whatever. And they would watch Isaac and his men. They would watch them redigging these wells or digging new wells. And they would wait until the wells were done, and then they'd pop in there and say, oh, this is our land. Sorry, you did all that work and got that well done, but this is ours. We own this. And Isaac was not a fighter. We know Abraham had some fight in him. He could do a lot with 318 men. But Isaac is not a fighter. He's a peacemaker. And every time that they would go through all of that work to dig the well and get to the water and be excited to have that source of water for the family, for the household, for the little community there, it would get contended, and Isaac would just walk away, and he would go find another spot, and he would dig somewhere else. And eventually he comes to that one, he digs that one well, and no one contends with him, there's no problems, and he's able to claim that one as his own and stay there. So the room was provided for him by the Lord. And I see a lot of good spiritual guidance in that little principle. It's really good for spiritual life, and the message would be to be a determined spiritual well digger. Your family, your community, they need that open connection to the Lord. They need that open flow of the Spirit in their life. So pick your spots and dig. I'll explain what I mean a little bit more about this, but pick your spots, be determined, and start digging, start praying. Start studying. Start engaging in the local church. Find a spot where you can help. Begin to dig those wells. And if there's contention there, well, you stop. But you don't give up digging altogether. You go find another spot to dig. Listen, this is the same concept, really, as the whole closed door thing. When the Lord closes a door, you just let that door be closed. You don't take the fire axe to it, try to break that door down. No, you get the Lord's hint. That door was closed for a reason. So what do? You back off, you regroup, you pray, and then you go out and you start turning a bunch of doorknobs, right? To see what doors the Lord does open. It's the same with wells. And you got to be able to tell the difference when you're plugging into any aspect of ministry and beginning to dig deep for the depth of it, whether it's prayer, whether it's worship, whether it's ministry, whether it's personal devotion time, whatever well you're digging with the Lord, you have to know the difference of when it's the enemy trying to discourage you from a good thing and when it's the Lord letting that thing get plugged up or stolen from you or contended against so that you go somewhere else. Sometimes the Lord does that to help us to find His will. How do you know that? How do you know what the Lord's will is? How do you know what's the right well that you're digging, which well to fight for and which well to walk away from? Well, that I don't know. I don't know that answer. That's something you have to find out with the Lord. That's something you have to find out in the Scriptures. But I will say I have used this principle as a guide in ministry throughout my life. Back in, about 2008, 2009, I was living in Alaska there, and it was the first relocation I ever made where I didn't have a ministry plan lined up before I got there. All my other moves were ministry moves. This one was not. So I went up there and started looking around at the local churches, found a good local church that I wanted to attend, and I plugged in, started attending. The pastor there was a rookie. He was a new guy. He had been in a men's group down there in Washington, and his men's group leader thought he'd be a good person to come up north into Alaska and plant a church, so they sent him. He was learning as he went. Great guy, great heart, learning the Scripture as he was going, and I knew that, I understood that, and I came right alongside of him, and I didn't say anything about myself. I didn't volunteer my help in any way. I just sat back and I attended because I knew, small church, what he needs most is he needs people to just come in, be faithful in their attendance, pay their tithes, give in offerings, just be faithful attenders so that this thing can get built up and some good things can happen. And that's what I planned on doing. I didn't go in there and say, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Reverend Arlyn. By the way, I don't like that title because Reverend means revered one. And I assure you, I'm not a revered one. Neither is anyone else with that title. But I didn't go and introduce myself and share about my ministry experience. I didn't say, look, I pastored a bunch of churches. I'll help you do this thing. I'll tell you how to run it. No, that just has never been my heart, never been the kind of person I was. And I didn't go in there like that. And I didn't tell him everything that I could do to help him. I just went in to be a part, And something started happening at our Bible studies. They had open Bible studies. That's always opening a can of worms. You give open Bible studies and anyone can say anything, and they do. And it can get weird, and it does. And things can happen that you probably didn't want to happen just because you had an open Bible study. But they had these open Bible studies, and people would ask questions, and he was new. They'd go through the text, and they'd ask questions, and he'd say, I don't know. I don't know. Before long, he started turning to me. Arlyn, do you know? Well, I'd answer the question. And that kept happening week after week after week. And before long, some of the people started just bypassing the pastor and asking me the questions. I thought, oh, this isn't good. I see this going in a bad direction. And sure enough, it did. There became a suspicion between me and this fellow. And he began to look at me with suspicion. He began to eye me up as if I had a plan to come in there and unseat him as the pastor and take over the church. I can assure you nothing could be further from my heart. But that suspicion was there, and then the contention came. We started to have this contention in the ministry. He'd ask me to do things, and I'd start doing them. And there was a contention, there was a suspicion, there was something odd going on. I could see it in him. I could see the change in his interactions with me. So I decided, you know what? It's time to step out somewhere else and start digging other wells. I was just going to help him dig, even if it meant just sitting in the seat. I mean, that was my heart. I didn't have to do anything but sit there. I just wanted to help him in that way. But he didn't know that, and there was a contention there. So I went elsewhere, and I began to dig elsewhere. And before long, just as Isaac, because believe me, I've dug a lot of ministry wells that got plugged up. I've dug a lot of ministry wells that created a lot of contention, but the Lord eventually brought me to my Rehoboth, which would be right here, Anchored Fellowship, which started a few years before this place, and now here in this building, in this fellowship, as a combined group. So sometimes that's what we have to do. We just have to understand what's taking place as we're digging and working in the ministry or digging those wells to provide that salvation and that biblical doctrine to our families. We have to understand sometimes we just got to back off and begin to dig in other areas and begin to make the preparations for other works in other areas of ministry or spiritual life. So he finally finds his place here. Verse 23, then he went up from there to Beersheba. All right. Now, the Lord has brought him all the way to where he needs to be. If you look at where Beersheba is on the map, it's just south of Hebron, which was the, I guess you would say, headquarters or home, if you can call it that, of Abraham the pilgrim. So he's close. He's right there in the center of the land now. And look what happens when Isaac gets back to where the Lord wants him. Look what happens when Isaac gets back to the center of God's will, the center of the promised land. Verse 24, the Lord appeared to him the same night and said. So now the Lord is showing himself to Isaac and speaking to Isaac. See what great things can happen between you and the Lord when you just, get the hint. And let him push you back into the center of his will. He'll do that, He won't push you. He won't force your circumstances against your determinations. But if your lethargy is against your determinations, the Lord will help you to break that lethargy. If your interest or intrigue in the world is against your own personal determinations and you just got that internal struggle, as long as it's in will, in line with your determinations, the Lord will break all that stuff. He will push you. He will force circumstances to get you back to where He knows deep down you really want to be. And now that Isaac's there, man, the Lord is appearing and speaking. And He says this, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Yes, Isaac has got it now. He's where he's supposed to be. He's not running from the Lord anymore. He's not off somewhere else because he couldn't trust the Lord. He's back. He's in the center of his will. He's seeing and hearing from the Lord. And here's a good trait from Abraham that Isaac has just picked up. He builds an altar. Abraham was the guy that built an altar everywhere he went. Everywhere that Abraham went, well, except for Egypt, he was building a place of worship. He was turning it into a place of worship and dedication. And now here's Isaac doing the same thing. And I like the order a lot. You notice he builds the altar first before he ever pitches his tent. I think that's a really good idea. Start with an altar. Start with a place of worship, and then you can pitch your tent. Then you can make it your home, because when you bring the Lord's presence into a situation, that's a good place to dwell. He doesn't even set up home first and say, well, this is where I'm going to be. Now I'm going to pray and see if I can get the Lord in this. But he prays, he worships first. Verse 26, then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the commander of his army. And Isaac said to them, why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you? But they said, we have certainly seen that the Lord is with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you, and since we have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. Then he arose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another. And Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. Now, as we covered in our Luke study, as a believer, every unbeliever in relationship to you is pretty much going to begin in resentment, envy, hostility toward Christ, something along those lines. Jesus told us in John 15:19, if you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but because I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Jesus said, don't be surprised when the world hates you. It hated me first. Really, it hates me. And that hate is poured out on you. That's kind of where you start with the unbeliever. There's a natural animosity between the believer and the unbeliever. But as we said in our Luke study, things don't have to stay that way. Even though relationships with unbelievers may begin that way, they can change. Proverbs 16 verse 7 says, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. I think I see a little bit of that happening here. Isaac stunk the joint up. He came into town and just ruined the whole town. Maybe that's embellishing a little bit, but look, he really messed up. But he confesses. They push him out of there, and Isaac just after that confession, he continues on with the Lord, and good things are happening in the spiritual life of Isaac. And it gets to the point where even the enemies of Isaac recognize it, just as they did with Abraham. It was undeniable stuff, how the Lord was blessing this man Isaac. You remember all those words. Prosperity, prosperous, prospering, blessing, possessions, all those blessings that are on this guy. And they see it and they just can't refute it any longer. They just can't deny it. And so they say, we've got to come to terms on peace here. And they do just that. Verse 32, it came to pass the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. So he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba. Now Beer just means well of. And then Sheba means oath. So this was the well of oath. This was the well that was discovered, that was dug during this time of oath, and that's what they name it. Verse 34. When Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith, the daughter of Beri, the Hittite, and base math, not to be confused with algebra. This is just basic math here. Base math, the daughter of Elon, the Muskite who designed the Tesla that Barry drives. Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. So for just a moment here, the story at the very end switches to Esau, the eldest son of Isaac, and you're already starting to see from just now 2 stories about Esau what kind of path that Esau has chosen for his life, and it's not a good one. Now, he gets involved here in polygamy. We can ask the question, did these early folks know that polygamy was wrong? Absolutely they did. I mean, they knew from Genesis 2, that God created one man, one woman, and he created them to be together in one monogamous relationship. So polygamy cannot be explained away as okay in any way, shape, and form. And on top of that, he goes after heathen women. Jews weren't supposed to do that, right? Jews weren't supposed to go after people outside of the lineage, the genealogy, the family line there. But Esau does that. Does he know that frustrates his parents? Absolutely. In the future, I think it's Genesis 28, he's going to do it on purpose again. He gets mad at his parents, and he's going to do it purposefully. He's going to go out and find himself some more heathen wives, just to get them more angry. So Esau is very clearly showing us his character here. And we'll just close with this real quick. As we're seeing here, Isaac was no Abraham. Abraham did have some negatives, but he had a whole lot of positives. But as far as Isaac goes, Isaac seems to have effortlessly inherited the negatives, but not so effortlessly the positives. There are some positives here in this chapter, but this is really the whole story on Isaac. This is all that really can be told about Isaac, good or bad. And you compare that to the life of Abraham, you get 11 chapters in the Bible about this man, Abraham. And you see so many of his positives. But with the story of Isaac, pretty much you get 1+ chapter, a little over 1 chapter, a little bit from the previous chapter, and a little bit into the next chapter. And that's pretty much all you get about him, because Isaac just was not the same kind of giant of the faith as was Abraham. He gets the name cred, like the street cred. He gets the name cred. As you go through the Bible, you read it constantly. It's a way that God identifies himself. He says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. That name is big. We already discussed that name. He's a type of Christ. But we saw tonight in Genesis 26 that type has completely broken down. We see a lot of negatives in the life of Isaac, and that's okay. Types do break down. All of the types break down at some point. They only go so far. But here's what I want to leave you with. Just take this home with you and ponder this tonight. Think about this, pray over this, maybe into the next couple days. What kind of mark do you want to leave on the world? Do you want to have like Abraham? If God was going to write your story, would he need a book? Would he need 11 chapters like Abraham? 12 chapters like Jacob and Joseph? Or would he be able to summarize your life in just like a couple verses? I hope that's not the case. But really, the only thing that determines that is our decisions and how intensely and seriously we pursue the heart of God, how passionate we are about Him. That's really all there is to it. So you get to decide what kind of life you live. Do you live a life that would need a book to explain the things that God has done in your life, or would you get a footnote like Isaac? Would you get maybe a good name because of your general faith, but not really have the experiences to back it up? It really comes down to what kind of footprint you want to leave. Up in one of the churches I was working up in there in Alaska, this is a different church than the one I was referring to earlier. We had a policy. We owned a church ministry building that we used for midweek stuff and special events, and we had a policy paper, and one of those policy items said that if you use the church facility for anything, the church ministry facility for anything, our rule is this: leave a light footprint. And I think about that, and as far as that application goes, that's a great principle, but as far as life goes, it's a terrible principle. You don't want to leave a light footprint on earth. You want to leave wells behind. You want to leave a big footprint. You want people to know you were here, not so that your name can be lifted up or exalted, but so that that footprint that's left behind is attached to Him and glorifying Him. You want to leave something behind for this world. And that is totally up to us on how intensely we pursue that. I just do not want to go out with a light footprint. I don't want to die and just have people like never really know I existed. I want to leave something behind for Christ, not for me. I don't care if anyone ever sees a picture of me after I die. But I want them to know what I stood for. I want them to benefit from the study or the effort, some ministry work that I did, something. I want there to be some Christ benefit, some Christ glorification after my passing. I want to leave a big footprint on this earth. And I'm going to be constantly digging wells to try to make that happen. I hope you join me in that. I hope that's in your heart.